Hello everyone, welcome back to the Easy English Spark channel. I'm so thrilled to have you here today. I hope you're all feeling fantastic and ready to dive into something super valuable. In today's video, we're going to take you on an exciting journey through a story packed with powerful lessons. Not only will we explore the English language, but we'll also learn how to improve your listening, speaking skills, build your confidence, and become a more fluent English speaker than ever before. Whether you're new to the channel or a regular, get ready to light up your English learning experience. Let's get started. Chapter 1: A Tale of Two Worlds. In the heart of Yorkford, a city filled with towering stone buildings, muddy streets, and the endless noise of merchants calling out their goods, there lived a boy named Leo Hart. But unlike the noble families, who dined on roasted meats and slept in silken beds, Leo knew nothing of luxury. His world was one of hunger, filth, and hardship. Leo was born into a family of beggars. His father, Garrett Hart, was a cruel, lazy man who had long given up any hope of honest work. He spent his days drinking away the few coins his children managed to bring home and his nights enforcing his authority with a heavy hand. Leo's mother, once a kind woman, had been broken by years of hardship. She no longer smiled, no longer resisted, simply existing under the weight of their misery. Their home, if it could be called that, was a single cramped room in the poorest district of Yorkford. The walls were damp, the roof leaked when it rained, and the only warmth came from a small, cracked fireplace that barely had enough wood to keep the cold away. Leo slept on the floor, sharing a tattered blanket with his two sisters, Mara and Elise, who clung to each other for comfort. There was no privacy, no peace, only hunger and exhaustion. Every morning before the sun had fully risen, Garrett would shake his children awake and push them out into the streets. "Go, earn your keep," he would snarl. "And don't come back until you've got something to show for it." Leo and his sisters would then scatter through the city, standing at street corners, stretching out their dirty hands and pleading with passers-by. "Please, sir, just a penny for some bread. Miss, have mercy. My sister hasn't eaten in days." Some days, kind souls would drop a coin into their hands. Other days, they would be ignored, or worse, chased away by city guards who saw beggars as nothing more than pests. And if they returned home empty-handed, Garrett's wrath was swift. The sting of his belt, the sharp slap across the face, Leo had learned long ago that failure was not an option. Despite it all, Leo dreamed. He dreamt of a world beyond the filth and suffering, beyond the cruel streets of Yorkford. He dreamt of a place where children were not forced to beg, where fathers did not raise their fists in anger, where warmth and kindness were not luxuries. And most of all, he dreamt of kings and princes, of mighty rulers who wore golden crowns and lived in castles so grand they seemed like something out of a story. The only true happiness Leo ever found was in the company of Father Benedict, an elderly scholar who lived in a small, quiet room at the back of the same crumbling building where Leo's family stayed. Father Benedict had once been a teacher in the royal court, but now he lived among the poor, spending his days reading ancient books by candlelight. Unlike the other adults in the slums, He treated Leo with kindness. Whenever Leo could escape from his father's watchful eye, he would slip into Father Benedict's room and listen in awe as the old man spoke of the world beyond Yorkford. He told Leo about Kingsbury Palace, the grand home of King Aldrich, and the prince who would one day rule after him, Prince Alden. He spoke of fine silks, glittering jewels, and feasts so extravagant that tables overflowed with food. But it wasn't just the riches that fascinated Leo. It was the way of life. "How do princes speak?" Leo would ask. "With grace and confidence," Father Benedict would reply. "And what do they learn?" "They study languages, history, law. They are taught how to rule, how to lead." Leo's eyes would widen with wonder. "I want to learn," he would whisper. "I want to speak like a prince." Father Benedict chuckled but did not refuse him. Though Leo had no books of his own, the old man began to teach him little by little. He taught him how to speak with proper words, how to stand tall instead of slouching, and even shared with him a few words of Latin, the language of scholars and nobles. At night, when the city grew dark and silent, Leo would lie awake, staring at the crumbling ceiling above him, imagining a different life. In his mind, he was not a beggar but a prince, dressed in fine clothes, walking through marble halls, and dining on the finest meals. He imagined himself standing before a great audience, speaking like a noble, commanding respect. But dreams were dangerous in a world like his, because deep down, Leo knew the truth. Princes and beggars did not belong to the same world, and yet fate had other plans. Chapter 2. A Royal Encounter. The streets of Yorkford were always alive with noise, vendors calling out their goods, children running barefoot through the alleyways, and the occasional clang of the city guards' boots on cobblestone as they patrolled the markets. But there was one place in the city where everything changed: Kingsbury Palace. It stood at the heart of Yorkford, a magnificent structure of white stone and towering spires. The golden banners of King Aldrich waved in the wind, and the royal crest, a golden lion upon a red shield, was carved into the enormous gates. Beyond those gates, a world of unimaginable wealth and power existed, a world far removed from the Bow, one Leo Hart had known all his life, and today Leo would see it for himself. Ever since Father Benedict had told him stories of Prince Alden, the heir to the throne, Leo had longed to catch a glimpse of him. What did a real prince look like? Did he walk like a king already, with his head high and his shoulders straight? Did he wear a crown even when he wasn't ruling? Did he look as powerful as the books described? Determined to find out, Leo made his way through the crowded streets, dodging carts and slipping past merchants who shooed him away with irritated glances. The closer he got to the palace, the cleaner and grander the city became. The wooden shacks of the slums were replaced with elegant stone houses, and the muddy streets turned into well-paved roads. He could see noblemen in rich cloaks, their boots polished, their rings sparkling under the sunlight, and then, finally, he reached the palace gates. 2 guards stood on either side, their armor shining in the midday sun, their spears crossed before the entrance. Leo stopped a short distance away, his breath caught in his throat. He had never seen such grandeur. The gardens inside were lush and perfectly trimmed, with fountains spraying water into the air like magic. Servants bustled about, carrying baskets of fine fabrics and trays of food more luxurious than Leo had ever dreamed of tasting. He pressed his fingers against the iron bars, trying to see past the guards. Maybe he's inside right now, he whispered to himself. For several days, Leo returned to the same spot, waiting at the gates from morning until dusk, hoping for a glimpse of Prince Alden. But each day, he saw only noblemen and servants coming and going, never the prince. Until today. Leo had been staring through the gates when suddenly, the great palace doors opened. A boy emerged, stepping into the sunlight. At first, Leo thought it was another noble, but then he noticed something different. This boy walked with confidence, but not arrogance. His clothes were finer than anything Leo had ever seen. A deep blue tunic lined with gold thread, boots polished so perfectly they reflected the sun. But it wasn't the clothes that made Leo stare. It was the boy's face. He was young, perhaps, the same age as Leo. His dark hair was neatly combed, his sharp eyes full of curiosity. Leo's breath caught. Prince Alden. He had found him. Excitement rushed through Leo's chest. He had to get closer, had to see him more clearly. Without thinking, he took a step forward. "Back away, beggar!" Before Leo could react, a guard's hand struck his shoulder, shoving him to the ground. The force sent dust flying into the air, and for a moment, Leo was too stunned to move. His hand scraped against the rough stone of the street, his elbow burning where it had hit the ground. The prince turned sharply, his brows furrowing. "Why did you do that?" he demanded, stepping toward the gate. The soldier immediately straightened. "Your Highness, he's just a beggar. He was too close to the palace." Leo lifted his head, his heart pounding. He had seen cruelty before, but this was his chance. His one chance to speak to a real prince. Desperation overtook him, and before he could think, the words tumbled out of his mouth. "Your Highness, I only wanted to see you." Prince Alden's expression softened. He tilted his head slightly, studying Leo with an unreadable look. "And why is that?" Leo swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the guard's stares on him. But he couldn't. "Stop now, because you're the prince," Leo said, scrambling to his feet. "You're going to be king one day. I've never seen a real prince before." Alden took a step closer, gripping the iron bars of the gate. "And what do you think a prince should look like?" Leo hesitated. He had never been asked a question like this before. "Like someone powerful," he said carefully. "Someone who speaks like a king, walks like a king. Someone who—" He trailed off, suddenly feeling foolish. What was he doing? This was the Prince of Yorkford. Why would someone like Alden care what a beggar thought? But to Leo's surprise, the prince smiled. "I see." Then, without warning, he turned to the guards. "Open the gates." The guards stiffened. "Your Highness, that's not—" "I gave an order." The prince's voice was firm, his posture straight. There was no room for argument. Hesitantly, The guards exchanged glances before stepping aside. One of them pulled the lever, and with a loud metallic creak, the gates swung open. Leo barely had time to react before Alden gestured for him to enter. For a moment, Leo's mind went blank. The world outside the gates, the streets, the dirt, the shouting of merchants, felt so far away. And then, slowly, he stepped inside. The gates closed behind him. Inside the palace walls, everything was different. Leo barely had time to take in the sights, the perfectly trimmed gardens, the polished stone pathways, before Alden spoke again. "Tell me your name." Leo hesitated. Was it really okay to speak so casually with the prince? "Leo," he finally said. Alden nodded. "Come with me, Leo." And then, just like that, the Prince of Yorkford led a beggar boy into his world. Leo had no idea that this moment would change both their lives forever. Chapter 3. Trapped in Luxury. For the first time in his life, Leo Hart walked through the gates of Kingsbury Palace. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward, his worn-out boots making almost no sound on the smooth stone pathways. The air smelled different here, not of damp wood and rotting food like in the streets, but of fresh flowers and something else he couldn't quite place, something expensive. The gardens stretched out around him, filled with bushes carved into perfect shapes and fountains that sparkled under the afternoon sun. Everything was perfect, too perfect, and for the first time Leo realized just how different this world was from his own. He swallowed hard, stealing a glance at Prince Alden, who walked ahead of him with the natural grace of someone who had never once worried about where his next meal would come from. The prince didn't seem nervous at all, but Leo was. He knew he didn't belong here. At any moment, a nobleman might appear, take one look at his ragged clothes, and order him thrown out. But Alden didn't seem to care. The prince led Leo through a grand archway into the main palace. The moment they stepped inside, Leo stopped, breathing for a second. He had never seen anything like this. The walls stretched high, lined with golden chandeliers that bathed the space in warm, flickering light. Rich carpets covered the floors, soft and thick, like nothing Leo had ever walked on before. The ceiling was covered in paintings, stories of warriors, kings, and battles, their eyes staring down at him as if questioning his presence here. Leo felt impossibly small, but Alden turned to him with a smile. "You look like you've never been inside a palace before." Leo hesitated. "I haven't." The prince tilted his head slightly, considering this. Then a strange glint entered his eyes. "Let's do something fun." Before Leo could ask what he meant, Alden suddenly began unfastening his royal tunic. Leo's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" Alden grinned. "We're going to switch places." Leo took a step back. "Switch places? What do you mean?" Alden pulled off his rich blue tunic and tossed it onto a nearby chair. Beneath it, he still wore a fine, white undershirt, but without the fancy tunic, he already looked less like a prince. "I mean, you'll wear my clothes, and I'll wear yours." Alden gestured at Leo's tattered shirt. "Just for fun. Just for a little while." Leo stared at him like he had gone mad. You want to dress like me? Alden nodded eagerly. Yes, I've always wondered what it's like to live outside the palace. Just for a little while, I want to see what it feels like to be ordinary. And you, he gestured at Leo, you can see what it feels like to be a prince. Leo hesitated. This was insane. A prince wanted to dress like a beggar? A real prince? But the more he thought about it, the more something inside him stirred. This was his chance, a chance to feel, even just for a moment, what it was like to be someone else, someone important, someone who mattered. Before he could change his mind, he nodded. Alden grinned. Great, let's do it. The change. A few minutes later, Leo stood in front of a massive mirror, hardly recognizing himself. The prince's tunic was soft and smooth against his skin, the gold embroidery glinting in the candlelight. His old rags lay crumpled on the floor, now worn by Alden, who laughed as he examined himself. I look like a street rat. Alden smirked, running a hand through his messy hair. Leo was still too stunned to speak. He turned in front of the mirror, barely able to believe the princely figure looking back at him. Was that really him? His usual slouched posture had straightened. His face seemed cleaner, more refined somehow, simply because of the fine clothes. For a single moment, he looked like he belonged here. Alden, however, wasn't finished. He leaned closer, inspecting their reflections. We look alike. Leo blinked. What? We have the same height, almost the same hair color. Even our faces. They're not so different. Alden grinned. If someone wasn't paying close attention, they might think we were the same person. Leo opened, his mouth to argue, but before he could, the door suddenly burst open. A servant rushed in, out of breath. Your Highness, the king has requested your presence immediately. Leo froze. The servant's eyes were on him, not on Alden, on him. Alden stepped forward. Wait, But before he could say anything, 2 palace guards entered behind the servant. Come, Prince Alden, one of them said firmly. Your father awaits. Leo's stomach twisted. They think I'm the prince. Before he could protest, the guards gently took him by the arms and began leading him toward the door. Wait! Leo turned desperately to Alden, but the real prince only grinned and gave him a playful wave. Enjoy it, Leo, and then the doors shut. The prison of gold. Leo's heart raced as the guards led him through a maze of lavish hallways. He tried to speak, to tell them there had been a mistake, but his throat felt dry. Would they even believe him? Would they listen to a boy dressed as a prince, claiming he was a beggar? A terrifying thought crept into his mind. What if they thought the real Prince Alden was an imposter? What if they threw him out into the streets? His hands turned cold. What have we done? Finally, the guards brought him to a massive chamber. At the center of the room, sitting on a grand, jewel-encrusted throne, was a man Leo immediately recognized, King Aldrich, the King of Yorkford. His piercing gray eyes locked onto Leo, sharp and unreadable. You're late, Alden. Leo's voice caught in his throat. This was dangerous. This was madness. He needed to tell the truth. Right now, he opened his mouth. We have urgent matters to discuss, the king interrupted. Sit down. A servant pulled out a golden chair, and Leo felt himself being pushed toward it. He sank into the seat, his heart hammering in his chest. He was trapped. For the first time in his life, Leo Hart was surrounded by wealth, power, and luxury. And yet, he had never felt more like a prisoner. Chapter 4. A Prince Among Beggars. The moment the heavy palace doors slammed shut behind him, Prince Alden realized he had made a terrible mistake. The golden halls, the polished marble floors, the gentle warmth of candlelight, all of it was gone. Instead, he stood alone in a world of filth and decay. The streets of Yorkford, which had always seemed so distant from the palace, were now his reality. The air smelled of rotting food and damp stone. The cries of merchants and beggars filled his ears, and the roads beneath his bare feet were cold, hard, and uneven. For the first time in his life, Alden was not a prince. He was just another boy in rags, and nobody noticed him. Nobody bowed. Nobody greeted him with respect. Nobody cared. A harsh welcome. The prince's excitement had faded quickly. At first, he had been thrilled. He had wanted to experience life outside the palace, to feel what it was like to be an ordinary boy, free from rules and expectations. But now, fear crept into his chest. He had no money, no guards, no servants. Just the rough, oversized rags Leo had worn, hanging loosely on his frame. He turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of where he was. The people here looked different, faces gaunt with hunger, clothes torn and dirty. A woman clutched a baby to her chest, whispering to it as she rocked back and forth. A man with hollow eyes leaned against a crumbling wall, watching the crowd. With suspicion, Alden had seen poverty from the palace windows. But he had never felt it. He took a cautious step forward. Wham! A blur of movement. Suddenly, he was shoved from the side. He stumbled, nearly falling to the ground. Laughter rang out. A group of street boys stood nearby, their faces full of mischief. One of them, a lanky boy with wild hair, smirked. "Look at this one," he sneered. "Dressed like us but walks like a lord." The other boys snickered. Alden straightened, regaining his composure. "How dare you?" Before he could finish, the wild-haired boy grabbed his wrist and yanked. Alden staggered, caught off guard, as the boy's other hand darted toward his pockets. But there was nothing to steal. Confused, the thief frowned. "Where's your coin, pretty boy?" Alden ripped his arm free, his royal instincts kicking in. He stood tall, lifting his chin, just as he had been trained to do in the face of disrespect. "You dare lay hands on me?" he said, voice steady. "Do you know who I am?" The boys blinked. Then, they burst into laughter. "Oh, this is rich," one of them cackled. "Another street rat who thinks he's a prince." Alden scowled. "I am Prince Alden of Yorkford, heir to the throne. I order you to—" A hand slammed against his shoulder, shoving him backward. He crashed into a stack of wooden crates, pain shooting through his ribs. "Shut up, beggar." The boys surrounded him, eyes filled with amusement. "He talks like a noble," another said. "Maybe we should teach him how to talk like one of us." Alden's heart hammered. He had never been in a fight before. He had trained with swords, yes, fought duels in the palace courtyard, practiced combat under the watchful eye of his tutors. But this was different. This was real. The wild-haired boy raised a fist. "Oi! Leave him be!" A sharp voice cut through. The street. Alden turned just in time to see a towering figure storm toward them. The boys scattered instantly, vanishing into the maze of alleyways. And then, Alden saw him, Garrett Hart, Leo's father, captured by the wrong man. Garrett was a large, broad-shouldered man, his face lined with years of cruelty. His small, dark eyes locked onto Alden and his mouth twisted into a sneer. "You're late." Alden froze. Late? Oh no, he was wearing Leo's clothes. And now, Leo's father thought he was his son. Garrett grabbed Alden's arm in an iron grip. "Didn't bring home any coin, did you?" His voice was low, dangerous. "I should have known. Useless." Alden tried to pull away. "Unhand." "Me this instant." Garrett's grip tightened. "Oh, you've got a sharp tongue today, don't you?" He yanked Alden forward, dragging him through the streets. "Maybe a few good lashes will fix that." Alden panicked. This man was going to beat him. He was a prince. No one had ever dared lay hands on him like this. He had to make him understand. "Listen, to me," Alden tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. "I am not your son. I am Prince Alden. You must take me back to the palace." Crack! Garrett's palm struck Alden across the face. Pain exploded across his cheek, and for a second, Alden saw stars. His knees buckled and he stumbled, barely keeping himself upright. The world tilted. Garrett sneered. "Talking nonsense now? You'll learn." Alden tasted blood in his mouth, and for the first time, true fear took hold of him. Thrown into darkness, Garrett dragged Alden through the slums of Yorkford, past broken-down homes and flickering lanterns, until they reached a crumbling shack. He threw open the wooden door and shoved Alden inside. The moment the door slammed shut behind him, Alden knew he was trapped. A woman, Leo's mother, looked up from where she was sitting near a dying fire. Her face was weary, her eyes dull. With exhaustion, she frowned. "Garrett, what?" "He didn't bring a damn thing," Garrett spat. "And now he's got some wild idea that he's a prince." Leo's mother's eyes softened as she looked at him. "He looks pale," she murmured. "Maybe he's sick." "Sick my arse," Garrett snapped. "He's lazy, and I'll beat that out of him." Alden's stomach dropped. No, this couldn't be happening. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be in the palace, enjoying his little game of switching places, not stuck in Leo's life. Garrett unbuckled his belt. Alden's breath hitched, and as the man took a step toward him, raising his arm, Alden did something he had never done before. He ran. Chapter 5. The Burden of a Crown. The cold, hard stone of the palace floor felt foreign beneath Alden's feet as he was dragged once more through the grand hallways of Kingsbury Palace. It was as though the very walls were closing in around him, their once welcoming warmth now stifling, suffocating. The weight of the palace's grandeur seemed to press down on his shoulders, heavier with every step. The grandiose halls, with their intricate tapestries and glittering chandeliers, no longer felt like a place of privilege. To Alden, they now felt like a prison, a gilded cage that had ensnared him for so long, and now, in his time of need, trapped him all the more. He had been pulled through these very corridors before, but this time it was different. This time, he wasn't being led toward the throne in his rightful place as a prince. He was being escorted like an intruder, a pretender, a boy in rags who had no business being here. The palace guards, who had once bowed and greeted him with respectful silence, now ignored him completely, treating him like another nameless face in the crowd. But it wasn't their treatment that stung the most. It was the empty echo of his footsteps as he walked the halls. The silence that filled the vast spaces seemed to mock him. The palace, which had once been a symbol of power and privilege, now felt cold and alien. He had not asked for this life. He had never wanted to be a prince. It was forced upon him. And now, with everything turned upside down, he was beginning to see how much he had taken it all for granted, how much he had missed, how much he had lost. A painful realization. As he was led through a grand hallway, Alden caught a glimpse of himself in a large, polished mirror. For the first time, he saw himself not as a prince, but as just a boy. Someone with no special status, no crown, and no responsibilities. His clothes, once rich and shining with the insignia of royalty, were now dirty and torn, worn by Leo's old life. His face, though still handsome, seemed younger and more vulnerable than he remembered. He couldn't help but think about what had happened, about how carelessly he had treated his title, how flippantly he had chosen to play at being a beggar. What had he been thinking? The guards eventually stopped before a massive door, its wood carved with intricate patterns and crowned with the royal crest, the very crest that Alden had grown up with, the symbol of his father's kingdom. This was it. He was going to face his father. And for the first time in his life, Alden was afraid. The king's command. The door creaked open, and Alden was led into a grand chamber, its high ceiling supported by columns so tall they seemed to disappear into the darkness above. At the far end of the room stood King Aldrich, his father, on a throne so large that it seemed to swallow him whole. The room was quiet, save for the steady sound of Alden's breath. His father's sharp gaze landed on him, piercing through him like a blade. "You are late." The king's voice was cold, regal, and filled with authority. It was the same voice Alden had heard every day of his life, so familiar, and yet, in this moment, terrifying. Alden hesitated. I'm sorry, Father." His voice faltered, but he quickly composed himself, meeting his father's eyes. "I was busy." The king raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. Busy, the king repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. His eyes narrowed. Busy with what? Alden was about to speak, but found that his words were lost. The truth was, he didn't know what to say. How could he explain his foolishness? How could he explain that he had spent his time walking the streets as a beggar, pretending to be someone he wasn't, only to find himself trapped in a world he was no longer sure he wanted? The weight of the situation, the weight of the crown, pressed down on him harder than ever before. You will not be so casual with your responsibilities. The king's voice rang out, echoing through the hall. The people are counting on you, Alden. You will learn the burdens of this crown. Alden stood there, silent, unable to speak. How could he possibly explain? He had been given everything, a life of power, of privilege, and he had thrown it all away without a second thought. He wanted to be like the common people. He wanted to know their struggles. But now, standing in front of his father, Alden realized the true weight of the responsibilities he had never truly understood until now. Being a prince was not a game. It was not a luxury. It was a sacrifice. His father's eyes bored into him. You will sit with me today and begin learning the workings of this kingdom. There is no more time for games, Alden. Your time to rule has come. Alden nodded silently, his heart sinking in his chest. This was it. The time had come for him to face the reality of his position, the long hours of responsibility. The next few hours were a blur. Alden sat beside his father at a long golden table, surrounded by royal advisors and noblemen. They spoke in circles, discussing trade agreements, military strategies, and diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms. Maps and scrolls were spread across the table, and Alden had to fight to keep his eyes from glazing over. He had never been interested in politics. As a child, he had been more concerned with riding horses, with playing in the gardens, with anything that distracted him from the weight of his destiny. But now, as he sat at the table of kings, he realized just how little he knew about the kingdom he was supposed to rule. How unprepared he was. The advisors continued to speak, their words blurring together, and Alden's mind began to drift. Prince Alden, your thoughts? The question came out of nowhere, snapping Alden back to reality. All eyes turned to him. Alden's chest tightened. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. He had no answers. He had no solutions. How could he? I don't know. His voice was barely above a whisper. I need time to understand what's happening, what it all means. The king stared at him for a long moment before nodding. Very well. But know this, Alden. His father's tone softened, but the seriousness never left his voice. There is no time for uncertainty. You will grow into this role, whether you are ready or not. Alden felt the weight of his father's words press down on him, heavier than any crown ever could, the price of power. The meeting continued, but Alden barely heard the words anymore. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the streets he had walked, on the life he had briefly experienced as a beggar. The freedom, the simplicity. the peace that came from not carrying the weight of a kingdom. But then, the truth struck him. This was his life. This was the life he had been born into, the life that came with the title of prince, of heir to the throne. And he could never escape. This was his burden. It was not something he had chosen, but it was something he would have to bear, no matter the cost, no matter the pain. Chapter 6. A Friend in the Shadows. The corridors of Kingsbury Palace felt like an endless maze to Alden as he wandered through them, his mind swirling with the weight of his newfound responsibilities. The throne room, the council meetings, the constant pressure of being the future king, it was all too much. Every time he stepped into a room, it felt like the walls were closing in on him, and no matter how many servants, guards, or advisors surrounded him, he had never felt more alone. Alden had always been used to being surrounded by people, by the comfort of his father's influence and the expectations of the court. But now, faced with the cold reality of what it meant to rule, he felt isolated, a stranger even in his own home. The palace, once a place of power and grandeur, now seemed to him like an alien world. As the days wore on, Alden began to feel trapped in his own life. The noblemen who attended the council meetings spoke to him with formal respect, but there was no one he could truly call a friend. There was no one he could confide in. His father, though a powerful king, was a figure of authority. And the courtiers, while polite, were always careful with their words. They watched him like hawks, studying his every move, waiting for any sign of weakness. He missed the days when he had been free, when the world had felt like an endless adventure. He missed the laughter, the carefree moments that had been stolen from him the moment he was crowned. He longed for the simplicity of the streets, the lives of those who were not burdened with the weight of a kingdom. But then, one evening, something happened. Something that would change his entire perspective on his place in the palace and in the world, the mysterious stranger. It was late, and Alden had just finished a grueling meeting in the council chambers. His father had pushed him hard, expecting more from him than he had been prepared for. The strain was beginning to show on his face, and his shoulders felt like they were carrying the weight of the kingdom itself. He walked down one of the quieter hallways of the palace, seeking refuge in the solitude. The palace was mostly silent at this hour, and the soft echo of his footsteps was the only sound that filled the air. As he turned a corner, he was startled by a voice, low but clear, almost unnervingly familiar. "You look troubled, Your Highness." Alden stopped dead in his tracks. The voice was coming from the shadows, where the dim light of the candles didn't quite reach. His heart skipped a beat, but his instincts immediately kicked in. Who was it? And how did they know who he was? "Who's there?" he called out, his hand instinctively moving to his side, where his sword would have been if he had been in his usual royal garb. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall and cloaked in dark fabrics that made it hard to see their face. A man, but one whose features were obscured by the dim light. Despite his imposing figure, there was a strange calmness about him, like someone who had no need to prove their strength. "It's only me," the figure said with a soft chuckle. And I've been watching you for some time now. Alden's brow furrowed. Who are you? The stranger stepped closer, into the light, and for the first time, Alden saw the face of the man who had been speaking to him. His features were sharp, almost regal, with piercing eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was older than Alden, perhaps, in his mid-30s, with dark hair that curled around his face. His clothes were simple, travel-worn even, but his presence was undeniably strong. He did not seem like a commoner, nor did he look like a man who belonged to the court. The man smiled, though there was something mysterious about it. The name's Rowan Drake, he said smoothly, almost with a knowing air. And I've come to offer you something you're sorely lacking, Your Highness. Alden raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Rowan's eyes glinted in the dim light. A friend among strangers. For a moment, Alden was stunned. He had never expected to hear such a thing from anyone in the palace. The people here were formal, careful with their words. There was no room for friendship in this world of power and, politics. Alden took a step forward. I don't know you. How can I trust you? Rowan studied him for a moment, then shrugged nonchalantly. You don't have to trust me, Alden, but I think you'll find my offer is better than the alternative. The cryptic nature of his words didn't sit well with Alden, but there was something about Rowan's presence that drew him in. There was an air of confidence, something almost calming, despite the fact that they were in the dim, empty hallways of the palace in the middle of the night. I don't know if I need a friend, Alden said, his voice hesitant but filled with a quiet curiosity. I have enough people around me. Rowan raised an eyebrow. Do you? Do you really think the people around you are friends? He gestured vaguely toward the corridors of the palace. Those people, Your Highness, they're only interested in what you can give them. They want to know what they can get from you. It's not friendship, it's politics. Alden felt a surge of discomfort at the truth in Rowan's words. He couldn't deny that the people around him, the noblemen, the advisors, the courtiers, had always been careful with their praise, their flattery. They were never truly honest with him. Rowan stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. You're not the only one who feels out of place here. And I'm not the only one who sees what's happening. You may be the prince, but you're still just a boy. And you need someone who understands that. Someone who doesn't want anything from you. Alden met his eyes, sensing a genuine honesty there. Something about Rowan's words felt like a lifeline, a chance to have someone in this palace who wasn't watching him with hidden motives, someone who wasn't trying to gain favor or power. After a long silence, Alden nodded slowly. All right. What do you want in return? Rowan smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. Nothing, Your Highness. I'm here to help. I've been watching you for a long time now, and I know what you need. What you want. The burden of secrets. Over the following days, Alden found himself meeting with Rowan in the palace's quieter corners. Rowan had become his secret ally, offering advice, guidance, and something Alden hadn't realized he needed, a true companion. They spoke about everything, about the palace, about the courtiers, about the burdens of leadership that Alden had never been prepared for. Rowan was sharp, with a mind that seemed to see through the layers of deception that ran through the palace. He was well versed in political strategy, but he didn't speak in riddles or forced pleasantries like the others. He spoke plainly, offering insights into what was really happening in the court. But most importantly, he listened. Alden could speak freely in his company, no longer burdened by the expectations of the throne. Rowan didn't expect anything from him. He didn't want to take advantage of Alden's position. He simply wanted to help him understand what it meant to rule, and more importantly, what it meant to be a human being. A quiet pact. One night, as they walked through the gardens of the palace, Rowan turned to Alden and said something that would stay with him forever. "You don't have to do this alone." Alden stopped in his tracks, turning to face him. "I don't know how to do this." His voice was quiet, vulnerable. "I didn't ask for this. I don't want to rule this kingdom. I didn't ask for a crown. I just want to know what it's like to be free." Rowan nodded, his expression understanding. "You're not alone anymore." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Alden felt like maybe, just maybe, he had a chance to be more than just a prince. Chapter 7. Betrayal and Imprisonment. The air in the grand hall was thick with tension, every whispered word carrying the weight of political maneuvering, every glance sharp with hidden agendas. Alden stood at the far end of the room, his shoulders stiff, his hands gripping the sides of his cloak as he observed the nobles who surrounded him. The weight of the crown was unbearable, but he had no choice but to wear it, whether he was ready or not. He was no longer the carefree prince who had run through the gardens, pretending to be a hero. Now he was burdened with responsibility and the knowledge that every decision he made would affect the lives of thousands. But despite all the power at his fingertips, there was something unsettling in the air. The palace felt like a nest of vipers, and Alden was unsure whom to trust anymore. For the past few days, he had felt something shift. It was subtle at first, a sense of unease, a feeling that something was wrong. But now, standing in the grand hall, surrounded by whispers of politics and power, Alden began to see it more clearly. There were eyes on him, but they were not the eyes of loyal subjects. They were the eyes of men with their own agendas, men who would use him for their own gain. A sudden clang of metal cut through the murmurs of the court, and Alden snapped his gaze toward the entrance. The great doors of the hall opened, and a group of soldiers entered, their armor glinting in the flickering torchlight. They were not the familiar palace guards, but soldiers Alden had never seen before. Rough-looking, with the cold eyes of men who had seen too much. "Your Highness," one of the soldiers said, his voice cold, his eyes never leaving Alden. "The king has requested your presence immediately." Alden felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The king? His father. Something didn't feel right. The soldiers approached, their movements calculated, deliberate. Alden knew they weren't here to deliver a message. His instincts screamed at him, telling him to move, to run, but he stood frozen. His father's summons was not something one could ignore. He had been expecting something different, something more benign. A meeting, perhaps, or some royal command that he had grown accustomed to. But this was different. The soldier's grim expressions told a different story, and Alden's heart began to race. "What's going on?" Alden demanded, his voice hoarse with anxiety. "Why have you come for me?" The soldier's lips curled into a cold smile. "Your father has given us new orders, Your Highness." The shocking betrayal. The soldiers grabbed Alden's arms with a grip that was too firm to be mistaken for friendly. They weren't there to escort him. They weren't taking him to a private meeting with the king. Instead, they began to drag him toward the doors of the hall. The motion was swift, violent. "No!" Alden shouted, shaking off their grip. "What is this? What's happening?" But no one answered. The courtiers in the room, once his allies, looked away, too afraid to meet his eyes. They watched as he was dragged out of the room, his mind racing with questions. Why was he being treated this way? Why was no one coming to his aid? Had he misjudged his friends in the palace so terribly? The hallways of Kingsbury Palace felt impossibly long as the soldiers led him down a narrow corridor, past guards who didn't flinch or move to stop them. It was as though they were all in on some dark secret, a secret that was unfolding right before Alden's eyes. It wasn't until they reached the prison gates at the lowest part of the palace that the full weight of what was happening struck Alden. His chest tightened, and his mouth went dry. They were locking him up. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't a simple misstep. He was being betrayed, thrown away like he was just another pawn in a game he didn't understand. They shoved him roughly into a cold stone cell, the iron door slamming shut behind him with a deafening clang. Alden stumbled, crashing into the stone wall as the heavy, unforgiving door creaked shut. For a moment, he couldn't believe it. He felt a chill creep up his spine. How could this happen? How had he gone from being the Prince of Yorkford to being locked away in a dark, damp cell beneath the very palace that was supposed to be his home? The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor outside his cell. The guards walked away, leaving him alone in the darkness. A betrayal, worse than death. Alden's mind raced as he sat in the cold, damp cell. He had known that his father had expected much of him, but this was something else entirely. What had he done wrong? The pain of betrayal was far worse than any wound. Rowan, his only true ally in the palace, hadn't come to help him. The noblemen, who had whispered their promises of loyalty, had stayed silent. He had been abandoned by everyone he thought he could trust. Hours passed. No one came. No one offered an explanation. No one came to check on him. In the cold silence, Alden's thoughts turned inward. What had led to this moment? Why had his father ordered his imprisonment? The truth hit him like a blow to the chest. The betrayal ran deeper than just the palace guards or the courtiers. This was his father's doing. King Aldrich, the man he had once admired, the man who had taught him everything about ruling, had turned against him. Why? For what purpose? Suddenly, a flash of understanding flickered in his mind. The throne, the kingdom. It was all about control. Alden wasn't ready to rule, not in the way his father had wanted him to. Perhaps he had been too weak, too unsure of himself. But this betrayal, this imprisonment, was a direct reflection of what his father thought of him. He wasn't ready, and perhaps he would never be. The true face of power. As the hours turned to days, Alden began to realize just how trapped he was. He wasn't in prison because of something he had done wrong. He was there because of what he represented. A future king who was unfit to rule. His father had seen it. The court had seen it. And now, Alden saw it too. Rowan had been right. The people who surrounded him, who whispered in his ear and smiled when they thought he was watching, were all part of a system built on betrayal and self-interest. There was no room for real friendships, no place for true loyalty in this world, and, worst of all, Alden was alone. Days passed with no word from the outside world. The silence was deafening, the solitude unbearable. The walls of the cell seemed to close in on him, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen from the life he once knew, a glimmer of hope. But as the days blurred into one another, Alden noticed something, a small crack in the wall of his cell. It wasn't much, just a narrow slit, barely large enough to see through. But through it, Alden caught a glimpse of something beyond. The faint flicker of torchlight, the distant sound of footsteps. He wasn't completely alone. He had one chance to get out, and he would take it. But even if he escaped, where would he go? He could not return to his old life. His father's betrayal had shattered everything Alden had ever known. He couldn't trust anyone, not even his own blood. And yet, in the darkest corners of the palace, one thing remained, a spark of defiance. Alden was not ready to be a prisoner. He wasn't ready to bow to the false king his father had become. Chapter 8. The Truth Revealed. The days in the cold stone cell of Kingsbury Palace stretched into what felt like an eternity. Each hour passed with agonizing slowness, and the oppressive silence was a constant reminder of Alden's fall from grace. The once glorious life of the prince, the boy who had been groomed to rule a kingdom, had slipped from his grasp like sand through fingers. Now, he was nothing more than a prisoner, trapped in the dark underbelly of the palace he had once called home. Alden had heard the echoes of footsteps, the muffled sounds of the world outside his prison. But no one came for him. The royal guards, who had once been at his beck and call, now ignored his existence as if he had never been the heir to the throne. Rowan, his secret ally, had vanished, and Alden had no idea where he was or why he hadn't come to his aid. Betrayal was the only thing that seemed constant in the palace, and Alden felt as if he had been abandoned by everything he had ever trusted. Days turned to weeks, and it wasn't until the cold morning light filtered through the narrow crack in the wall that something changed. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps outside his cell, a familiar, yet unexpected sound. Alden lifted his head from where he had slumped on the cold stone floor, his heart racing with anticipation. The cell door creaked open. The harsh light from the corridor spilled in, casting long shadows across the floor. Standing at the entrance was Rowan Drake, his face marked by the passage of time and the weight of the secrecy that had surrounded him. Alden couldn't believe his eyes. Rowan was here, and he was finally going to have the answers he had been so desperate for. The truth in the shadows. Rowan stepped inside, his eyes scanning the cell briefly before locking onto Alden with a quiet intensity. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy, filled with a mix of relief and unspoken tension. Rowan had been Alden's only true ally, and yet Alden had begun to wonder if he too had betrayed him. "How are you holding up?" Rowan asked quietly, his voice surprisingly gentle for someone who had just broken the silence of the prison. Alden swallowed, trying to push back the flood of emotions that had been building up. "I've been better." His voice was rough from days of little food, exhaustion, and frustration. "Where were you? Why didn't you come for me sooner?" Rowan's gaze softened, though there was a sadness in his eyes that Alden had never seen before. He took a step forward, dropping something into Alden's hands. A small, carefully folded piece of parchment. "I'm sorry, Alden. Things are complicated." Rowan's words were laced with an unspoken weight. "I've been trying to keep you safe, but the truth is much darker than you realize." Alden's pulse quickened as he unfolded the parchment. It was a letter, written in a hand he did not recognize. As his eyes skimmed the words, a sense of dread began to build in his chest. The letter contained details of political intrigue, alliances, and a shocking revelation, one that made his blood run cold. The letter was a message from his father, King Aldrich, detailing the true nature of his plans that had been in motion long before Alden had ever stepped foot on the throne. "What is this?" Alden breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "What have I gotten myself into?" Rowan stepped closer, his face grave. "Alden, you were never meant to rule this kingdom." The words hit Alden like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him. He staggered back, his hand clutching the letter tightly. "What do you mean?" Alden whispered, his heart racing in his chest. "What do you mean I was never meant to rule?" Rowan took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto Alden's with a mixture of sorrow and regret. "Your father never intended for you to be the king. He had plans to crown someone else, someone far more obedient, far easier to control." Alden's mind reeled. He tried to make sense of the words, but they didn't add up. His father had always treated him with respect, even affection. Hadn't he? He had taught Alden everything about the throne, about how to rule, about the weight of the crown. The kingdom was his to inherit, wasn't it? "But I was the heir," Alden said, his voice trembling with confusion. "I was supposed to be the next king. My whole life has been leading to this moment. How could my father—" "It was never your destiny," Rowan interrupted gently, his voice heavy with truth. Your father's real plan was to keep you in the shadows, to use you as a puppet. You were never meant to wear the crown. He was grooming someone else, Alden, someone far more malleable, someone who would bend to his will. The words struck Alden like a storm, crashing through the walls of his mind. His vision blurred, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. His father had lied to him. His whole life, his purpose, had been a lie. Everything he thought he knew about his family, about his destiny, it was all manipulation. Who? Alden asked, barely able to get the words out. Who did my father want to crown? Rowan hesitated, then spoke in a tone so quiet that Alden had to lean in to catch his words. Your brother, the hidden truth. Alden felt as though the world had tilted beneath him. His brother? But he had no brother. His father had never spoken of another child. Alden had been told from the moment he could remember that he was the only heir to the throne. Rowan nodded solemnly, his eyes never leaving Alden's face. You have a brother, Alden. His name is Cyril. He was kept hidden for years, locked away in the shadows while you were raised to take the crown. But he's not a prince by birth. He's your half-brother, the product of a secret affair your father had years ago, a secret the court has kept for decades. Alden's mind was in chaos. He tried to process the information, but it felt like too much. A brother? All these years, Alden had believed himself to be his father's sole heir, the one destined to rule the kingdom. But now it seemed like everything had been a facade. His entire life had been built on a lie. Why didn't anyone tell me? Alden demanded, his voice rising with anger. Why did my father keep this from me? Rowan's eyes softened with understanding. Because Cyril was never meant to take the throne. He was kept hidden, out of sight, until the time was right. But when your father began to fear that you were not fit to rule, he began to favor Cyril. Cyril would have been a puppet king, Alden. Your father would have controlled everything, using him as a figurehead. Alden's hands clenched into fists. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. His father had never wanted him to be a ruler. He had used him, trained him only to be the perfect tool to pass the crown to someone else. The escape. But Rowan's words had ignited a spark in Alden. He would not be anyone's puppet. He would not allow his father's betrayal to define him. We have to stop him, Alden said, his voice filled with newfound resolve. We have to stop Cyril from taking the throne. I'll take back what's mine. Rowan nodded, a small smile, crossing his lips for the first time. That's the spirit, Your Highness. Alden's journey was far from over, and the truth had finally been laid bare. But now he was ready to fight, to reclaim his place, to free the kingdom from the lies that had shackled it for so long. Chapter 9. The Struggle for the Throne. The weight of the crown was heavy on Alden's mind as he paced through the dimly lit corridors of the palace. Betrayal lingered in his heart, a constant reminder of the deception his father had woven around him for years. He had spent his entire life believing that the throne was his by birthright. But now, standing in the shadows of the royal halls, Alden felt like an imposter in his own life. His father, the king, had used him as a pawn, and his half-brother, Cyril, was being positioned to take the crown Alden had once thought would be his. The realization of what had been taken from him, what had been kept from him, made his heart burn with fury. He had been prepared for everything except the truth. But now, there was no time to dwell in bitterness. There was no room for self-pity. The kingdom was in turmoil, and Alden had to fight for what was rightfully his. The throne could not fall into the hands of a man who had been hidden away, manipulated, by their father to be a puppet king. Alden would not allow it. His every step echoed through the dark hallways as he made his way toward the throne room where the final battle for the crown would unfold. The plan was simple, but its execution would be anything but. His allies were few and his enemies countless. Cyril had been groomed for years, raised in secret, and now Alden feared the weight of his father's influence would be too much for him to overcome. But Alden was resolved. He would not let the kingdom fall under the control of a man who had never earned the crown. The hidden forces of power. As Alden reached the grand doors of the throne room, his thoughts turned to Rowan, his loyal friend, and the only person who had stood by him. Rowan had risked everything to reveal the truth to Alden, and now he had a role to play in the battle that was about to unfold. Alden didn't know if he could count on the support of the other nobles in the court, but he knew one thing for certain: he would never face this alone. With a deep breath, he pushed the grand doors open, stepping into the throne room. It was as magnificent as ever. The high ceilings, the polished stone floors, and the rich tapestries that adorned the walls. The throne itself, adorned with gold and jewels, gleamed in the dim light of the flickering candles. But now, the sight of it filled Alden with a deep sense of foreboding. This was the seat of power, the very symbol of his birthright, and yet it now felt like a distant dream. As he stepped forward, he was greeted by the sight of King Aldrich, sitting atop the throne, his stern gaze fixed on him. The king looked more imposing than ever, his once soft eyes now hardened by years of manipulation. He had played the Game of Thrones with a cold precision, and Alden could see that his father's plans were nearing completion. Cyril, standing beside the throne, looked every bit the puppet that Alden had feared he would become. "Alden," the king said, his voice heavy with authority, "you've finally come to your senses. It's time for you to step aside. You were never meant to rule." The words struck Alden like a blow to the chest. Never meant to rule. His whole life, he had been told he would be the next king, and now his father was telling him to give up the throne, to walk away. But Alden wasn't going to give up, not without a fight. "No." "Father," Alden said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him, "I will not step aside. This is my throne. You manipulated me, used me as a tool for your own selfish goals, and now you want me to bow down to a puppet?" His gaze shifted to Cyril, who stood silently beside the throne, his expression unreadable. "Cyril doesn't deserve this throne. You've hidden him away for years, raised him to be a tool in your hands, and now you want to crown him?" I will not allow it." The king's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a snarl. "You are nothing but a child who doesn't understand the intricacies of ruling. Cyril will be the next king, not you." The unraveling of power. At that moment, the grand doors to the throne room opened again, and Rowan Drake stepped inside, his face serious and grim. Behind him was a small group of loyal men, soldiers and advisors who had pledged their support to Alden in secret. The tide was beginning to turn. Alden could feel the shift in the air. The nobles, who had been silent up until now, were beginning to murmur among themselves. Some looked toward the king, some toward Alden, but the suspicion was palpable. The king, who had once been the unchallenged ruler, was now facing a challenge from within his own blood. The future of the kingdom was in the balance. "You think you can take my throne with a few loyal men?" King Aldrich sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're no match for me, Alden. You never were." But Alden stood tall, his heart beating with resolve. He had come too far to back down. Now, the truth had been revealed, and the people of Yorkford deserved better than a king who ruled through fear and manipulation. The time had come to take what was his and to reclaim the kingdom from the hands of a man who had lost his humanity long ago. "This is not just about the throne," Alden said, his voice growing stronger with every word. "It's about the future of this kingdom. It's about the people who suffer under your rule. It's about what's right. You may have manipulated everyone into thinking that Cyril is the rightful heir, but I'm here to show them the truth." Rowan stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "The kingdom is with Alden. It always has been. And it's time for you to face the consequences of your actions, Father." The king's face twisted with rage. "You dare defy me?" He stood from the throne, his voice booming with authority. "You will regret this. Both of you." The battle for the crown. The tension in the throne room reached its peak, and for a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The air was thick with the weight of history, the battle for the throne that had been brewing for years now finally coming to a head. Alden knew what he had to do, but he also knew that it wouldn't be easy. The kingdom's future depended on the outcome of this moment. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the clashing of swords. The king's personal guard, who had been waiting for a signal, charged at Alden and Rowan, their weapons drawn and ready. But Alden was prepared. With a quick movement, he unsheathed his own sword, the metal gleaming in the torchlight. Rowan, as always, was at his side, fending off the first wave of attackers. The clash of steel rang out, and the throne room descended into chaos. The battle was fierce, with Alden and Rowan fighting side by side, their movements synchronized as if they had practiced this for years. But it was not just the guards they were up against. It was the weight of the entire kingdom. For every strike Alden made, he could feel the weight of his responsibility. This wasn't just a fight for his life. It was a fight for the soul of Yorkford, for the future of the kingdom. He fought not only for himself, but for the people, for the nation that had been suffering under his father's rule. As the battle raged on, Alden finally locked eyes with Cyril, who had remained silent through it all, standing at the side of the throne, watching with cold detachment. Cyril's expression was unreadable, but Alden could see the hesitation in his eyes. Cyril wasn't the man his father had made him out to be. He wasn't the puppet the king had tried to turn him into. "Cyril!" Alden shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This is not your fight. You don't have to follow him." Cyril met his gaze, and for a moment, Alden saw something in his eyes, something that looked like doubt. But before Alden could say another word, the king bellowed in fury. "Cyril, don't listen to him." But it was too late. Cyril turned away from the throne, stepping back from his father's side. He raised his sword, not against Alden, but against the guards who had been loyal to their father. The tide of the battle shifted as Cyril joined Alden, his blade cutting down his father's loyalists, the end of an era. The battle was not over yet, but the momentum had shifted. The king's forces were no match for Alden's growing army of supporters, and soon the throne room was filled with the sounds of victory. The king, realizing his position was no longer tenable, made a final desperate attempt to regain control. But it was too late. King Aldrich was dragged from the throne by his own soldiers, now loyal to Alden, his reign ending in disgrace. Chapter 10. A Just King. The dust had barely settled in the throne room when Alden stepped forward, his boots echoing across the marble floor. The weight of the throne, the burden of leadership, felt more real than ever before. The kingdom had been torn apart by lies, betrayal, and bloodshed, but now it was up to him to stitch it all back together. His kingdom, his future. He was no longer just a boy caught in a game of politics. He was a king. As the echoes of the battle faded, the throne room was eerily silent. The once glorious walls, adorned with banners of gold and crimson, now stood witness to a turning point in the kingdom's history. The clash of swords had been replaced by the low murmur of the court, all eyes on Alden as he moved toward the throne. It seemed almost unreal that he was standing there, the very spot where his father had once sat with the air of unquestionable authority. But now that throne was his. Alden's steps were slow, deliberate. Every inch he moved felt as though he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. His heart beat in his chest, each thump reminding him of the responsibility that came with the crown. As he reached the throne, he paused for a moment, looking at it. A symbol of power, of control. But it had also been a symbol of tyranny under his father's rule. This throne, this crown, was no longer a tool of oppression. It would be the symbol of justice, of a kingdom that had been forgotten, ignored, and neglected. The first act of a king. Alden took his seat on the throne, the cold stone beneath him grounding him in reality. The murmurs of the court had died down, and now there was nothing but silence as the nobles and advisers waited for the new king to speak. They knew the gravity of the moment. Change was coming. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting to see what kind of king he would be. Would he be like his father? Would he rule with tyranny and fear? Or would he choose a different path? Alden took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, and then he spoke, his voice calm but firm, carrying through the room. I know that I have not earned this crown by the traditional means. I have not spent my life preparing to rule, and I have made mistakes that I will not hide from. There was a collective intake of breath. The court had expected a king to stand before them with pride, with words of assurance, of grandeur. Instead, they saw a vulnerable young man, one who had been forced into a situation beyond his control, now admitting his imperfections. But there was something different in his eyes, a determination, an unspoken promise to those who had stood by him. I have not been the heir I was meant to be. I have lived in the shadow of lies, of deception, of a crown that was never truly mine. But now, the kingdom belongs to its people. I will rule for them, not for myself. The nobles exchanged glances. Some nodded in agreement, others looked unsure, their loyalties still divided. But the fact that Alden had admitted his flaws, his humanity, instead of hiding behind the guise of perfection, began to win them over. Alden's eyes swept across the room, pausing on the faces of the nobles and his closest allies. Among them stood Rowan, who had been by his side since the beginning. Rowan had proven to be a steadfast friend, someone who never asked for anything in return but had given everything to see Alden rise. He was more than an ally now. He was a brother in the truest sense. Alden knew what he had to do next. His first act as king would be to seal his commitment to the people, to prove that he was not simply going to be a puppet like his father had planned for Cyril. He would create change. Let it be known that no one in this kingdom will be left behind again, Alden continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. No more will the poor go hungry while the rich feast. No more will the cries of the people be ignored. I will bring justice, and I will bring equality. At that, a murmur of approval swept through the room. It was a rare thing to hear in a court where the wealthy and powerful held sway over everything. The nobles, who had once ruled the kingdom with an iron fist, were now hearing a king who spoke their language, but with the promise of a better world for the common people. They would have to change their ways, or they would be left behind. The Council of Change. After Alden's speech, a new council was formed, one that would reflect his ideals. Gone were the days of self-serving advisors, those who cared only for their own fortunes. In their place, Alden appointed those who had the people's best interests at heart. Advisors who were known for their wisdom, their integrity, and their commitment to fairness. Among the new council members was Lady Isabel, a noblewoman who had long championed the rights of the poor, and Sir Malvin, a former soldier who had fought on the front lines for years and had seen firsthand the suffering of the kingdom's citizens. Alden had spoken with them both privately, and they had agreed to join his cause. The people of Yorkford would have a voice again. Real change was coming. The court watched in stunned silence as Alden appointed his new council, a group of men and women who had nothing to gain but the betterment of the kingdom. It was clear that the times were changing, and the once immovable power of the nobles was being challenged. The reforms begin. Alden's first decree as king was bold and far-reaching. Land reforms would be introduced, ensuring that landowners could no longer hold power over the people's livelihoods with unfair rents and harsh labor laws. The kingdom's farmers, who had suffered under the weight of corrupt landlords, would now have the means to own the land they worked. Taxes would be restructured, making them fairer for those at the bottom while ensuring the kingdom could still function. The rich would pay a higher share, but the poor would no longer be burdened with impossible debts. In addition to these economic reforms, Alden ordered the establishment of schools in every corner of the kingdom, accessible to children of all classes. Knowledge would no longer be the domain of the elite. Education would be the birthright of every child in Yorkford, a way to ensure that the future generations would never face the same inequality Alden had grown up with. But Alden knew that words alone wouldn't change anything. The kingdom's heart had to be won over with action. And as the days turned to weeks, and the weeks to months, Alden worked tirelessly to ensure that these reforms were not just promises, but realities. A kingdom united. Despite the challenges, Alden's rule was beginning to take shape. The nobles, although reluctant at first, began to see that their lives wouldn't be ruined by Alden's reforms. They would simply have to adjust. And those who refused to change would find themselves on the wrong side of history. Alden's heart swelled with pride as he watched the kingdom slowly heal. His father's legacy had been one of tyranny and manipulation, but Alden was determined to be different. His legacy would be one of justice, compassion, and equality for all. In the coming years, Alden would face many challenges, but one thing was certain. He would not rule with an iron fist, but with the wisdom gained from humility, experience, and the support of those who truly cared about the people. The kingdom of Yorkford would rise again, not on the backs of the poor, but with them at the forefront, the future ahead. One evening, as the sun set over the vast horizon, Alden stood on the balcony of the palace, looking out over the kingdom. That was now his responsibility. The road ahead would not be easy, but he felt ready. The struggles of the past had shaped him, and the future was full of promise. The future of the kingdom was in his hands now. And Alden, the once broken prince, was now Alden, the just king. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.